poker friends, welcome to another episode of Navanat on No Limit Hold'em. I'm introducing a new thing called Strategy Lab where we're going to be exploring some ideas. I thought about some different variety of different things I could have brought in. Maybe this isn't the exact direction that I'm going to want to go, but I wanted to start off with something a little bit less controversial. But the idea is going to be to start moving into controversial ideas and maybe trying to buck the curve, try to stay ahead of the game instead of just talking about what other people are talking about and talking about what other people are already doing and have already figured out. Maybe we can talk about some new ideas. But today we're going to just be talking about dealing with squeeze plays. So, this is really a problem in cash games for me when I've got a very bad but aggressive, like lag-tard or agri-tard, agri-fish opponent that's opening a lot of pots, and I want to be flat calling with like a pretty strong range of hands in position and 3-betting them just with a polarized range. But I don't really want to be 3-betting them a lot with, like, let's say that the agri-fish is in the hijack, I'm in the cutoff, and the squeezer's on the button. It's not great because I want to be able to flat call the loose players' open raises with hands like king, queen, and ace, jack, ace 10 suited, pocket 9s, pocket 10s. Hands that, if I 3-bet them, my opponent's not going to call with very many second-best hands, and he's not going to fold any better hands. And so I want to just take hands that are, marginally ahead of his range and take a flop with them where I have a skill edge, I have positional advantage, and I've got some card edge. And the problem here is that when we're dealing with a squeezer, very often we're going to either have to play like a raise or fold strategy, regardless of how we look at it, it's going to have a negative impact on the game that we want to play. So if we're getting squeezed a lot, we've got a squeeze-happy lag, especially a good, competent lag behind us, or multiple squeeze-happy lags behind us, but we've got loose, aggressive, kind of bad players opening in front of us. What do? We'd really like to, like I said, flat a lot of hands in position, take flops with all 3 of our post-flop edges intact. We want to 3-bet a polarized range and flat call with a bunch of hands that are marginally ahead of our opponent's range. And we don't like calling and getting squeezed when we've got a hand like, ace 10 or king jack suited, king queen offsuit, ace jack offsuit type stuff. So the squeezers can really put us in a bad spot where they almost force us to play like a 3-bet or fold game where we really don't want to be playing a 3-bet or fold game. So what are our options? Well, we can play raise or fold with most of our range. We can basically 3-bet a merged range in position against the lag to discourage our opponents from squeezing. Then we can maybe just flat call with like pocket pairs and stuff that can stand getting squeezed. But it's bad. It's not a great thing. Or we can overfold our range relative to the opener's range. When this guy's opening, he's a bad loose aggressive villain. He's opening too wide. We can just kind of fold the stuff that we would like to flat, like ace 10 suited, king jack, stuff that we know is ahead of their range, but definitely cannot hold up to any pressure and really isn't going to be super monstrously profitable anyway. We can just let go of the bottom of our flatting range. Or we can call and play pots out of position with these medium strength, moderately good hands against our aggressive squeezers. Which can be okay, but it's obviously not going to be great to play a capped range out of position in a bloated pot against a player who's aggressive and knows what they're doing. And the last option, flat call some of our strongest hands so that we can open a back raising range, and that's what we're going to talk about today. What is back raising? Well, back raising is simply when we flat call an open raiser, we get squeezed by a player, so we call and another player behind us raises, like 3-bets. After one player opens, we call, then there's a squeeze 3-bet behind us. Very often the first player is going to go away and we're almost never going to have a hand, usually under normal circumstances when we flat call and cap our range that can combat this 3-better or this squeeze. So what we can do is we can start flat calling like aces and kings and queens and ace-king, so that when we get squeezed, we can come back over the top and be happy to play for stacks or take the pot down that way. If we open up a back raise range, then we also want to have some bluffs in that range. So the idea is, as long as we have like aces, kings, and queens in our flat calling range, our range is not capped, and we'll be able to come over the top of the squeezer for value. And if we're not capped, then we can come over the top for value. Then we can also come over the top as a bluff without being exploited. Okay, so when do we back raise? When we expect to be squeezed a lot, it makes sense to open a back raising range, period. We want to ideally flat call in position on an aggressive player with some big hands that expect to be pretty profitable flat calls and a pretty good adjustment all by itself. So if we're getting already some value, some deception value by like flat calling pocket kings, queens, aces in position against an aggressive player who's going to be very barrel happy, then that's like the ideal spot, because now we can call even if the guy doesn't squeeze. We're still doing okay, just having flat called pocket kings instead of 3-betting them, and we can expect to make a lot of money with our opponent's aggressive mistakes post flop because we've under-repped our range. So we want to have big hands in our range like aces and kings, but we also want to have some other hands in our back raising range for balance, for board coverage, and to make sure that we can take advantage of the fact that our opponent's probably squeezing too many hands, or at least we want to be able to get value from aces eventually. So in order to get value, we need to have some semblance of balance and splash in some back raise bluffs. We want to be able to 4-bet over the squeeze happy lag behind us to put him in tough spots, and it's often ideal to do that with a balanced range, but you can start off doing that with a not so balanced range. I want to talk about a situation that happened to me in a live game. So there's 2 rules that come up and that are great to follow in poker. Number 1 is never show your hand unless you have to, and the other one is never say never, right? So I'm in this exact spot. I've got a player that's really, really bad, opening a ton of hands. He's ISOing everybody, and I'm able to flat call him with like king, queen suited and ace, jack, and go to the flop in position, and he's like barreling my improvement cards. He is c-betting 100%. He's just really the best player to have to your right, and to employ this like flat call merged range and 3-bet polarized, because when I do 3-bet, he's folding an awful lot. But I had a guy sitting behind me who was making life hell by squeezing me relentlessly, like almost every time over like an hour and a half period, hour, 2-hour period that I flat called this guy. This dude would squeeze me, and he was he just sat down at the table. I was up almost a full buy-in that came almost entirely from this other dude's stack. So we get into a pot. The initial open raiser, this loose aggressive player, opens from middle position, and I flat from, I believe it was the cutoff, and get squeezed by the button. I've got queens. The original opener folds. I come over the top with queens. My opponent, the squeeze happy lag, folds his hand, and I show the queens and mention to him that I flatted with the queens, trying to trap the first guy. You know, I didn't want to make it so obvious that I was trying to show him queens, so he knew that I had, big hands in my flatting range. I didn't want to make it seem like I was trying to get that across to him. I wanted him to kind of almost discover for himself that it was a bad idea to squeeze me. And from that point forward, I was able to go back to my default strategy, play very profitably against the bad, loose, aggressive player to my right, and I never got squeezed again for the rest of the session. So when the back raise continued, if we think the player who's opening will play poorly against our flat call because he's going to make a lot of mistakes, especially aggressive mistakes post-flop, especially when we under-rep our hand, and if we know some other mistakes that he's making that we can exploit, these are great times to think back raise, because we don't want to go for a back raise, have it blow up in our face, right? So if we think the players behind us will be able to make our life difficult with a lot of squeezes and a lot of pressure post-flop, with our capped range, and if we think we can expect them to make mistakes against our 4-bets, like folding incorrectly, or even if they just 3-bet too often or squeeze too often, and we can just kill their equity by coming over the top, and maybe by flatting we get them to put money into the pot that they would not have otherwise put into the pot. But we can also use the back raise as a deterrent, is what I'm saying, just to keep these players from ruining our time. because we want to have this loose, aggressive kind of bad player to ourselves, and we want to be able to polarize our 3-bet range and flat call a ton of hands in position against them. Is back raising exploitable, and is it an exploitation? Well, most players don't squeeze as often as they ought to, according to GTO. Most players just don't squeeze often enough. So many of the players that actually squeeze some of the time will stand out, and they'll look to us like they're overdoing it, but they might actually be using it correctly, and strategically they could be pretty close to equilibrium or correct play. But if our villain is squeezing tons and tons and tons, if your opponent is squeezing more than GTO, believe me, you will know it. If he's squeezing far more than GTO, we don't necessarily want to discourage that player from squeezing. If he's squeezing a decent little chunk of the time and just enough to screw up our game plan against the bad player to our right, then that's when we want to discourage. But if he's squeezing the hell out of us, then we actually may do better by keeping his squeeze bluff range intact and flatting him with some of the hands that we flat called with the intention of maybe back raising, like pocket aces. Just overcall or call the open raiser when the guy when the guy squeezes, just flat him and just check call him off. You know, you're going to be in a pretty small stack to pot ratio with pocket aces, and you can probably feel pretty happy about getting the money in on most runouts. So if villain is squeezing something closer to correct, then it can be good to discourage him by like showing the hands like I mentioned in the story. Constructing a back raising range, we want to choose hands and really more importantly choose spots where flat calling the open is good even when you don't get squeezed, right? We talked about that a little bit already. We want to use our strongest hands that we'd happily get all in with if villain decides to follow through with this squeeze, and like pocket aces, pocket kings, and really pocket pairs are of different sizes are pretty good candidates for this play. Because sometimes even when you're forced to get it in against the squeezer, because say he squeezes and you use your, I don't know, pocket eights as a back raise bluff, if he does happen to ship it on you, you're probably not in that bad a shape because you're going to be getting a good price in pot odds, and it's very unlikely that your opponent is going to be squeezing with a lot of pairs. So even if you have like pocket fives, you can back raise as a bluff, and if he ships it on you, sometimes you can go ahead and call, because your opponent's just not going to have pocket 6s, 7s, 8s, 9s, 10s in the range, because they won't squeeze those hands. They'll flat call, they'll overcall and set mine with them. So balance your huge hands with other hands that will block the squeezer's value range, and will flop okay in a 3-bet pot in case you're called, and use pocket pairs aside for that. So here I'm talking more like ace X suited, like ace wheel suited, ace 2 suited through ace 5 suited, and hands like, you know, king 9 suited that you know, but really ideally, we want to have things like king 10 suited, king jack suited that aren't quite good enough to actually call the squeeze, and that have multiple blockers, or we want to have pocket pairs. Now, if you know you're going to get squeezed light, and you're pretty darn sure you can outplay your opponent who's open raising, then you can go ahead and maybe splash in some suited ace, like weak suited ace X's and weaker king X suiteds. But typically we want to use hands with multiple blockers, ideally, that are not quite strong enough to call the squeeze, and that have multiple blockers and do okay equity-wise when you do happen to get called and have to play in a very small stack-to-pot ratio. So that means 2 big cards. Or we want to use pocket pairs so that if we face a 5-bet shove, we don't have to relinquish our equity. Remember, our opponent is not going to have very many pocket pairs in their squeezing range most of the time, because most of those hands will overcall instead of squeeze. Pocket 2s are very often the exact same hand in this spot as like pocket 8s are, because 7s, 6s, 5s, 4s, 8, all those hands are getting flat called pre-flopped. They're not going to be in your opponent's range anyway. Most of your opponent's range is going to be overcards when he squeezes, so when you come over the top, if you can come over the top and jam, even when he snaps you off with ace-king or ace-queen suited or whatever the case, you're going to be in a flip. And if stacks are different than that, you come over the top of him and he's able to come in for a jam on top of you, you probably can stack some of your pairs, knowing that your opponent is going to have a very overcard and bluff heavy range compared to having your pairs dominated. If you have pocket 5s, pocket 4s, pocket 2s, whatever, you're not very often going to be dominated when this guy goes crazy and rams and jams on you. with like pocket 8s or 9s, because at some point he would have called with 8s is kind of the point. Even, and especially 7s and 6s. So conclusion is, don't discourage your opponents from squeezing if they're way overdoing it. Flat and trap them. Use their aggression against them. Expect most squeezers to use a merged range and overdo it by a tremendous amount. That's how most players tend to set up their squeezes. They squeeze an awful lot, and they don't think about how they're squeezing as correctly as they probably could. It can be okay to show your hand if the back raise gets through pre-flop to discourage squeezes and let you play your most profitable strategy versus bad open raisers. And you can balance with bluffs, but tend to use a pair or double blocker type Broadway hands to take advantage of the lack of pocket pairs in your opponent's squeeze range. That is, use pairs to take advantage of the lack of pocket pairs in your opponent's squeeze range. Navinad, until next time, good quote, Luck, exclamation point, end quote. Good luck